Welcome back to Inside Politics. Our guest today, Dr. Thomas Schwartz of Vanderbilt University. He's a presidential scholar. We're talking about President John F. Kennedy's administration. Professor, 54 years later, what is the legacy of John Kennedy and his administration?
Well, I think there you have to look at how many events took place in the short period of the Kennedy presidency. You had the building of the Berlin Wall, you had the Bay of Pigs failed invasion of Cuba, you had the Cuban Missile Crisis. There were these central events in foreign policy in the Cold War. There was
beginning of advisors going to Vietnam.
The beginning of advisors going to Vietnam. There was a real sense that there was a turning point in the Cold War during the Kennedy years. At the same time, also, you had these significant civil rights actions during these years, both the demonstrations in Birmingham and the president's later speech on civil rights. You also had space program, which people sometimes tend to forget how central that was to American identity at the time. The idea that the United States needed to be first in technology.
Another legacy is the live presidential news conference. Eisenhower began that back in the 50s, but Kennedy really took it to an art form. Everybody's measured in a lot of ways by how he did in his news conferences. Do the others measure up?
Oh, absolutely. No, he had a very, very good relationship with the media. Now, he sometimes could get annoyed by the media, but he actually knew and cultivated reporters, cultivated journalists, Ben Bradley of the Washington Post, others, and he then was very effective. He understood, he himself understood a lot about journalists and the media, and he was an absolute skilled pro in handling television. Sexual
affairs were sort of off the record and not reported by reporters back in those days. That didn't change until the 70s and 80s. How would John Kennedy have operated in today's political environment when these things are constantly and right now, in terms of sexual harassment and assaults, are in the news all the time?
He would not have been able to operate in this environment. In some ways, you can sort of see Bill Clinton as having, in some ways, tried to be a little bit like John Kennedy at the time in the 90s and what happened to him. John Kennedy also had an affair with an intern in the White House. That was concealed at the time. There was a much different attitude toward the private situations of presidents. A politician who acted like John Kennedy would not have been able to survive in today's environment.
One other standard President Kennedy set, I think, was the presidential debate. While everybody talks about Lincoln and Douglas and that debate back in the 1850s, it would seem that the Kennedy-Nixon debates are the standard. That after that happened, there have been very few presidential cycles where there has not been a debate. The public and the media almost demanded.
Well, yes, except that what's interesting about that is that after the Kennedy-Nixon debates, because it was seen as so pivotal, in 1964, President Johnson refused to debate Goldwater. In 1968, Richard Nixon, who had been victimized, would not debate. And then in 72, they didn't come back until 1976. And then people were stunned by how Cold War the debates were. If you go back to those 1960 debates, they're very heavily on foreign policy.
Back when President Kennedy was in the White House, there was not a lot known about his health. They knew he had a bad back, but they didn't know many of the other things that he was suffering from, like Addison's disease. Another legacy of that happening, what happened with him, is that perhaps there's a bit more push by the public and the media to get disclosures not only from presidents but from candidates to know what their health is before and while they're in the White House.
Well, that certainly, I would have agreed with you that certainly was the case up through 2012. There was this incredible revelation of medical records. But in the 2016 case, both Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton were somewhat careful about what material was released. And there were rumors, of course, about Hillary Clinton's health, and then Donald Trump had that strange doctor who provided this very sort of summary report. It was quite.
You think that's an aberration?
I think so, but so many things have been aberrant since 2016 that it's hard to say what will hold.
A lot of talk about this during Ken Burns' documentary on Vietnam. He did send many more advisors there. There's also indications that he had become disillusioned and didn't think U.S. needed to stay there. How different would it have been had he lived in Dallas and been reelected? Do you think the Vietnam War might not have happened in the way it did?
I think yes. I do think it would have been different. The problem was that Kennedy was in a dilemma. On the one hand, he did not want to send combat troops to Vietnam. On the other hand, he did not want Vietnam to fall to the communists. In 1963, we still had a choice in that matter. That it had not come to that point. By 1965, that was the real choice Lyndon Johnson faced. And how President Kennedy would have dealt with it, I think he would have been more cautious, but I think he would have faced the same dilemma.
We've never been closer to an all-out nuclear war than what President Kennedy Kennedy faced in the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, when you look at that in today's context, what's been happening going on in Korea, did President Trump perhaps face some of the same problems Kennedy did in terms of getting conflicting information from his own trusted aides about which way he should go in from the military?
Absolutely. No, Graham Allison, the Harvard professor, has called the Korean crisis a slow-motion Cuban Missile Crisis. And Robert Kennedy, when he wrote a memoir of the Cuban Missile Crisis, said that President Kennedy had assembled around him some of the most outstanding advisors, but if half of them had been president, the world would have blown up. So in a way, you do come to realize that it does come in the end to the president's decision, and that's crucial.
President Schwartz, thank you so much. Professor Schwartz, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thank you very much for having me.
And thank you for joining us this week on Inside Politics. Hope you'll be back here again for a future show. If you can't get enough politics in the meantime, go to the News Channel 5 website. You'll find my Capitol View commentary there. There's a new commentary posted every Friday afternoon. Enjoy the rest of your weekend, and we'll see you back here next time. Goodbye.